overcome our environmental challenges. So we do a range of urban resiliency projects, and one of which is green workforce development. We also do K through 12 environmental ed in schools. We manage a park, and we have the Here Comes Solar program, which is what you're all here to learn about today. The status of solar in New York City. So over the years, the costs of solar have declined dramatically, both in New York City and in the country at large. And that's really great. There's been increased solar adoption, but the trend has not been quite the same for solar in New York City. There has been increased adoption, but we still face barriers here, one of which is construction red tape. So there's a lot of bureaucracy about permitting, a lot of time and money spent by installers getting projects mobilized in that way. There is system complexity for multifamily buildings, which we're going to learn about more. And a dense urban environment provides some technical challenges in terms of finding buildings that are suitable for solar, that are not shaded out, and that have big enough roofs. So that's why we established Here Comes Solar. It's an initiative of Solar One, and our mission is to make solar accessible to historically high barrier sectors, one of which is affordable housing, but really just multifamily housing in general. And so we provide technical assistance to make the process of going solar simple and affordable. And we really act as a consumer advocate for you all. So this includes a free site analysis, knowledge building, so educating your board if you're in a multifamily building, or educating any of the stakeholders, financing and incentive consultation, solar installer selection assistance, and again, sort of being your support along the whole way to make sure you have a successful initiative. Why is solar important in New York City? We know solar is the key to any climate solution, and buildings account for 70% of New York City greenhouse gas emissions. So having the opportunity to generate your own energy on your roof is a really significant impact. The New York City Climate Mobilization Act put a price on carbon and also requires solar on new construction projects. So this is the future that we're moving into in New York. Solar benefits our old constrained grid, which Annika has a great explanation for how that happens. And it can reduce the energy burden for low-income New Yorkers. And last but not least, more solar means more green jobs in the city. So now Annika is going to take us away with Solar 101.
Okay, before we do that, I think it's time to take a look at the poll. So I'm going to share the results of this. So it looks like the majority of people here are from Manhattan, but only, maybe not the majority, the plurality of people here are from Manhattan. We've got a lot of people from Brooklyn as well, and Queens, and also a good number of people from outside New York City. So welcome, that's exciting. The highest response for the kind of buildings we've got here is people living in co-ops, which is great. We love working with co-ops. We also have a lot of people in rental buildings. Totally understandable. I think all of us are also renters. And then about a quarter of people in single family homes. So we'll definitely talk about 1 to 4 family homes in a specific section of the presentation. And it looks like we've got a lot of people who get the basics of solar, some people who know a little bit, and some people who are pretty familiar and have just a few questions, a couple of people who know nothing at all, and we have a few solar whizzes. So hopefully you won't have to correct us during the presentation. I think we're solar whizzes too, though, so I think this will go well. Okay, so that's who we have here in the presentation. And it looks like we'll be able to cover all of these topics as we go. So Solar 101, the first thing to talk about is how solar panels work. So solar panels, they usually are mounted on the roof of a building. They collect energy from the sun and they turn it into electricity. That electricity goes through wires down through the walls of the building into a what's called an inverter, which is a box that turns the power from DC current, which is how it's generated, into AC current, which is what we use in our outlets and so forth. That inverter, then the energy goes to a meter where it measures how much energy is produced, and anything that goes that's used immediately inside the building just reduces how much you need to pay for energy from the utility. But if you produce more than you use at any given moment, which is pretty common most of the time in the middle of the day, in normal times when people aren't at home all day, the sun will be shining in the middle of the day, you'll produce a ton of energy, and so you'll sell a lot of it back to the grid, and the utility will credit you for that energy that you can use later on that night when the sun stops shining and you turn on all your lights and start using more energy. So over the course of the day, you often produce a lot of energy during the day and then use a lot of energy at night, and those even out through the use of solar credits and the utility. That's also true over the course of the year. So in the summertime in New York, there's more sun than there is in the wintertime, obviously. And so often people will generate so much energy during the summer months that they'll actually have what looks like a negative bill from their utility. And then in the winter, when there's less sunlight, you eat into those solar credits, you use them up. And so by the time the spring comes along, you're back at zero and you start the process all over again. So a little bit of logistics about solar panels themselves. Solar panels are incredibly long lasting and durable. They have at least a 25-year operating life. That means that the solar panels have a warranty of 25 years. So the solar manufacturer, if the panels stop producing what they should be producing in year 24, the manufacturer is responsible for replacing that panel so that you have the same production that you were expecting to get. One thing to note on that is that this means that solar panels are best on relatively new roofs, because if you think about it, you don't want to install solar panels on an old roof and then have to take the solar panels off, install the new roof, and then put the solar panels back on in just a couple years. So one of the things that we can help you determine is figuring out what condition your roof is in and whether it's a good candidate for solar. Often there are ways to work around it. You could do a new coating on your roof, or if the roof is older than 5 years but in good condition, that's also totally fine. But we can help you figure that out. Solar panels are very low maintenance. There's basically nothing that you need to do to keep them up. We often recommend that you check them once or twice a year to make sure that no debris has blown up over the panels, or anything has gotten dislodged or corroded or something. But in general, there shouldn't be anything that you need to do to make sure they're still working, with the one exception of the inverter that I mentioned before. That is the only electronic part of the solar system, and so that will likely not last the full 25 years. So when we do savings estimates, we account for the inverter needing to be replaced at about year 15. Maybe obviously, solar panels require direct sunlight because they use sunlight to make electricity. So that means that you can't have shade from trees, or more often in New York City, taller buildings. That's particularly true for shading coming from the south, because we're in the northern hemisphere. More often than not, the sun is to the south of in the southern portion of the sky, and so shading from the south is more important consideration. Solar panels are also grid connected, which is a great thing. It means that on a gray day like today, the solar panels still, you're not relying exclusively on the solar panels for your energy. The solar panels are probably producing a little bit of energy today, but not a ton. So you still have the utility to be your backup for all of your power, no matter what. But the flip side of that is that solar panels don't automatically give you power in a blackout. There's a really good reason for that. It's that if there's a blackout, then the utility will immediately send out line workers to try and fix the issue. But if your solar panels are sending electricity through those lines, you could electrocute the workers and kill them, which nobody wants. So there's an automatic shut-off switch on all solar systems that turns them off if the grid is down. You could theoretically add batteries to the back side of the system before the shutoff to allow you to have backup power in a blackout. But specifically in New York City, that's really difficult and really expensive right now because of regulations, and just batteries in general are pretty expensive. So if you're in New York City, that's essentially not possible at this time. A couple types of solar installations. So this is specifically for flat roofs. The most common is a ballasted array, which is where the solar panels are just weighed down on top of the roof using ballasts. So usually this means that the solar panels are in rows, and they have space between those rows so that they don't shade each other. So ballasted arrays are great. They're low profile. They're pretty close to the roof deck. There's no roof penetrations, which makes them simpler and cheaper to install. So that's often what people with larger roofs in New York City tend to go with. But if you don't have as much space, then they're not the best option. So if you're looking to fit more solar panels in a smaller amount of space, then what we call a planar array could be a better choice. A planar array is mechanically integrated, so it's attached to the structure of the roof, but the solar panels are closer together and you can fit more of them in a smaller space. This means you can get more solar production out of it, but it's a little bit more expensive because there's more engineering, more materials that need to go into the system. In any of these cases, even when there are roof penetrations, as long as you tell your roofing manufacturer that the solar is being installed and make sure that the solar installer does what the roofing manufacturer requests, then your roof warranty can be continued throughout the solar installation and beyond. So good communication is important, but it should never be a problem for roof warranties. A canopy array is basically like a planar array, except it's raised 9 feet in the air. So this means it can go across the entire roof despite any obstructions. So if you look at this picture, for example, these two vents here, that would be a problem for a ballasted array. You wouldn't be able to put those panels over the vents, but the solar panels can fit over it. It could also go over, there's a skylight here, there's no problem with that. And you could even put like a roof deck on your roof and enjoy the space on your roof and have a canopy over that as a little bit of shade or roof for your roof. The canopy array is obviously the most expensive because it has the most materials and engineering that goes into it. But sometimes it can be really beneficial and worthwhile to do. Okay, so now we're going to do a solar viability challenge to talk about what roofs are good for solar. So get your typing skills ready, because I'm going to ask you about a few buildings and whether they're good candidates for solar. So first of all, this is a building that someone asked us about in the last workshop, and I think it's a really good example. So if we take a look at this building right here, looks like it's a row house.
We can't see the building yet, FYI.
This before. I keep forgetting that I need to change my screen sharing. Okay, can you see my building now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry everyone. So this building here is in Brooklyn. It's just south of Prospect Park. And it looks like it's a row house. It's fairly small. You can see there's some trees around it. But this is north, this is south. If we look around, this is what we see. So take a look. What do you think about this building? Do you think it's a good candidate for solar? Do you think it's a bad candidate for solar? Do you think it might work? What considerations do you think we would be looking at here? Just type your answers in the chat. I'll give you some time to think about it. Got one person says new roof, which I'm not, yeah, the roof looks kind of bumpy. Exactly. So we've got a lot of people talking about the condition of the roof. Caveat that Google Maps images are always a couple years out of date. So it's possible they've redone their roof since then. But I agree, this is a very old roof. I wouldn't recommend putting solar on this roof as it stands. The trees are also probably an issue. It might be okay because as we talked about, the southern portion is more important. So, you know, this building to the north is probably more shaded by the trees than this one, which is just a little bit to the south of the trees. But it probably would get cut off by shade, you know, in the mornings and in the evenings. And it is also a small roof. So one consideration we'll talk about later is that there's a fire path requirement from FDNY that needs a 6-foot walkway from the front to the back of the roof. So that means that there's only really this portion of the roof that is available for solar. So you couldn't fit a very large system on here, but you probably could do a system that might cover a portion of the roof's usage, or you could put a canopy array, which would both solve the issue of the shading from the trees. It would solve the issue of the fire paths. And if it's a fairly old roof, but not old enough that it needs to be replaced, you could replace the roof underneath the canopy when that comes time. So a canopy might be the best option for them. Yeah, so let's take a look at this building now. This is a larger rental building. What do we think about this one? So there's no taller buildings close by. This taller building is to the northwest. We've got some chimneys in the middle of the roof. Maybe it's somebody's, maybe I'm looking at someone's home right now. What do we think about this one? Yep, definitely looks like a good size. There are a lot of buildings in New York City that are this particular H or I-shaped building. It actually works really well for solar. You can fit solar in all of these crannies, so it's good. The roof, we have someone saying the roof looks old, no apparent shade, but the structures on the roof would be in the way. Yeah, we can tell this roof is probably in better condition than this roof, but it's definitely not brand new. So we would definitely want to consider that. There is lots of space, but there are also, you know, 3 elements on the roof that would cause shading. A canopy array would be an option, but for this size building, it would be very expensive. And they might be able to cover all of their costs with a ballasted array as long as you stayed away from the parts that were shaded. So I think this is a great candidate for solar, and as long as you keep away from the bulkhead shading and the chimney shading. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. And we'll open it up for questions. So I see there are some questions already, but feel free to add more questions in the chat and we will start answering them. Patrick, can you read out some of the questions we've gotten so far?
Certainly.
Yeah, sorry about that. So from Amanda, a few minutes ago, she asked, is a canopy array also most vulnerable to damage, i.e. high winds? And
let's just do them one at a time. Okay. So a canopy array is one of the reasons why it's more expensive is because it has to be engineered solidly enough so that it's not vulnerable to damage. Obviously, you wouldn't want solar panels flying off in high winds and damaging themselves and other buildings. So all solar arrays, ballasted canopy, planar, whatever it is, have to be able to sustain at least 110 mile an hour sustained winds, which as far as I know, we've never experienced in New York City. So yeah, that theoretically that would be true, but we have very strict codes in place so that doesn't happen.
And the next question is a follow-up to that one. Also, are there special permits required for canopy arrays?
There are no special permits required for canopy arrays. There's a lot of permitting that goes into solar. In general, you need a Department of Buildings permit. You need a permit from the utility or approval from the utility, but nothing that's specific to canopy arrays. The only thing that maybe sticks out is that for landmarked buildings, you can't do anything that is visible from the street. So canopy arrays are often more visible from the street, and so that might be a problem. This building actually here is a good example of that. This is a landmarked building, and so they only put a canopy in the center of their roof where it wouldn't be visible from the street. At the front and the back of the roof, where it might be visible from the side streets, they did lower profile planar arrays.
There was also a question kind of in common form. It was, the roofs are white though. Was that intentional? White roofs reflect sunlight and are cooler than black roofs. So I feel like that one, like comprehensively in a way answers itself. It's true that like white coating for,
White coatings are always a good idea in New York City. We have a very strong heat island effect here, and so the more we can make our buildings reflect light, the better. But for solar specifically, it's actually especially good because the white roofs reflect a little bit of sunlight, and so it can improve the production of the solar panels, especially if you have panels like this, which are called bifacial panels, and they can absorb sunlight both from the top and from the bottom. So white roofs are just generally great.
Why don't we see more landlords installing solar in New York City?
That's a great question. Landlords, it's mostly about the benefit, because a lot of times landlords think that the benefit of solar would be going to their tenants and not themselves, and so why do something if it doesn't benefit you? Actually, landlords can benefit a lot from solar by reducing the common areas. We'll talk about this later in the presentation about how the building can benefit. And there's also a presentation that we're doing later on this month that's specifically for landlords. So I saw another question about asking your landlord to learn more about solar. We do have a presentation specifically for that, so feel free to pass that information along.
Let's do a couple more and then move on, and we can continue to answer questions at the end. And also we're available to answer any questions if you send us an email at any time.
Yeah, the next section is going to be about solar for renters, so we'll have plenty of other things to talk about.
All right. Patrick, want to pick one more question to send out?
That's interesting. What is the ratio or relationship between area with solar and amount of output?
Okay, so what we usually use as a rule of thumb is I think it's 12 watts per square foot. So if you want to be very wonky about that, that's the ratio we use. So the idea is that taking into account the obstructions on a roof and the potential shading, on average, if you have like for any given square foot on your roof, you would be able to produce 12 watts. And we can talk more detailed about that, but that's the ratio we use. Okay, so Patrick, looks like we have a lot of other questions, so we'll keep a running list of these and then we can answer the rest of them at the end.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good.
All right,
Okay.
Patrick, you're up.
Great. So what happens for the individuals that don't have good roofs for solar or they're renters? Well, there's community solar, which helps them to tap into solar energy without having to worry about installing solar on their roofs. So, as I said, not everybody can install solar in New York City. There are a lot of much taller buildings, especially in Manhattan, compared to the other residential buildings. So solar won't work for them because they're shaded in, or sometimes they have a lot of equipment on their roof, so that gets in the way of installing solar. And there's also the question of lack of home ownership, which is renters and people who rent units in buildings. They don't own the roof space, they're just renters, so they can't install solar if they wanted to on their buildings. So for these groups of people, community solar is a great option for them. This is a little 1 to 4 chart that we'll be talking about, breaking down the steps of community solar, starting from when it's installed, how the energy goes to the grid, how we, the subscribers, use it, and how it equates to savings. So number 1, the solar installation. So solar installer / manager will find a roof space to install a large solar system on it. And once they go through the whole permitting process that was mentioned earlier, and they get it finalized, and it's able to export energy into the grid, you have your community solar installation, good and ready to go. Once the energy is getting sent to the grid, Edison, they see the energy being sent to the grid, and we as subscribers can now opt into this solar installation to use some of that energy to save on our Con Ed bills. And the building in the middle is a representation of that community solar installation, and the buildings around, they could be for renters, they could be for small businesses. Anybody who pays a Con Ed bill could be tapping into that installation in the center for solar energy credits. Now, for this part is mentioning how it would appear on your Con Ed bill. The adjustments bar shows the solar credits that are being applied to your Con Ed bill to help reduce it. And right here is the next part of the equation, which is that once those solar credits are used to reduce your Con Ed bill, you would pay for those solar credits, but at a discount. So the $90.68 that you saw taken off the Con Ed bill, what you actually would owe is $81.61. And from that, you see a discount of $9.07, reflecting that 10% credit discount rate. And this orange open field up on top of the after bar shows the amount of money you're saving or not having to pay because of community solar. The large filled in orange bar shows the solar energy that you're now using to reduce your Con Ed bill. And this is important not only because this is solar energy, which is renewable energy, which is energy that doesn't pollute like fossil fuels, but also this is energy that's now in the city because of subscribers like us that help push that incentive to build more of these solar installations. And lastly, the logistics. These are important for us, which is that it's free to sign up for. There's a 12-month term, which means after 12 months, the agreement for community solar would end. But there's auto renewal. So after those 12 months, if you want to keep doing community solar and you like the savings, you can opt into it. It's not mandatory, the auto renewal. And if you move anywhere in New York City, as long as you still pay a Con Ed bill from your old apartment to your new apartment or place of residence, you can still keep those solar savings with your Con Edison account. And there's no cancellation fees. So for any reason, if you're moving and you feel the need to cancel, you can cancel it. You won't have to pay. It's written within the agreement. And these are all important because not every community solar in the city provides all these logistical terms within their agreements for community solar. And we've seen community solar providers that don't offer that 10%, but they offer 5%. We've seen some that do have cancellation fees. So it's important to us that we found community solar providers that have these terms and offer the best deal for you, the potential subscribers. And for us community solar providers, if we want to maximize our building's potential and we know our buildings have good roofs, we can talk to our property managers or property owners and landlords to tune into our future events. And they can learn more about solar and see why it's a good fit for not only themselves, but for our city's future. It's a green city. And here's the web with more text filled in to help explain it. I know it's a lot to take in, and it's definitely something that brings up questions. So now's a perfect time to ask them.
I see a couple of questions about ESCOs, which I'm happy to take on. So someone asked, what's the difference between community solar and having an ESCO provide solar energy like Green Mountain Energy or wind? So there's a lot of technical differences. I'll just say that the main principles to keep in mind about what's different is, one is that community solar is local. So it's actually pumping electricity into New York City's grid, which has a lot of benefits for how we manage our grid. Whereas when you use like a green energy ESCO, that's an energy supplier that could be selling you renewable energy certificates from renewable energy that could be anywhere in the country. So there's like a wind power plant in another state, and you're basically paying a premium to get that energy accounted for in your energy portfolio, but it's not actually physically coming to New York City. So that's one principle, and that's one reason why we like to support community solar. But the other is that community solar is guaranteed savings. So the way it's set up is that you're always paying for a credit at a discount and getting a higher value than that credit on your Con Ed bill. So you're paying the other solar company, but it shows up on your Con Ed bill as a higher value. And a lot of ESCOs are more expensive than your typical Con Ed energy mix. And sometimes the rates can get a little out of control over time. So we think community solar is really consumer friendly, and it's really important that we feel like advocates for saving money on energy when possible.
Awesome. There's also, does the community solar have to be installed in the same Con Ed zone as the customers that are opting in? There's a question. And it does for us as residents in the city. It would have to be within the same grid as Con Edison. It makes it a lot less complicated, and yeah.
But I should say, for those of you who aren't in New York City, it just needs to be in the same utility zone. So we've been talking a lot about Con Edison, because we work primarily in New York City, but the same is true for any of the utilities around the state. I think some utilities have different load zones, and so it needs to be within that load zone. But usually if you search for a community solar array or for a community solar provider, they will have you put in your zip code or your address, and it'll tell you what community solar arrays are possible to subscribe in. Community solar has been really booming in the past couple of years all around New York, especially in places that have more space than New York City. So there's a lot of options right now.
Very true.
I'd like this question about if a co-op already has a low rate for electricity. Who wants to take that?
Don't see it.
What if master metered co-op already has a low rate for electricity?
Oh, there it is. Okay. Do you want to take that, Annika?
So if a master metered co-op already has a low rate, you're probably fine. Master metered co-ops can do community solar. It depends on where in the city you are and what the value of solar is. Something like that, I think, is probably worth having a more in-depth conversation, looking at your rate, looking at what the specific value of solar would be for your location, and we can help you figure that out for you specifically.
But I think one concept to keep in mind is that you're not actually buying your electricity at a different rate than Con Ed. You're paying your Con Ed bill at whatever rate you're paying it, but community solar is a way of buying credits, and you're always buying the credit at a discount. So it's kind of like buying discounted money. So it's sort of irrespective of what you pay for electricity, you're still going to pay for your electricity, but you're getting credits to reduce that bill, if that makes sense. It's a little bit hard to sort of keep track, but it is irrespective of how much you currently pay for electricity. You're just sort of helping yourself add more savings onto that.
That's true. Yeah. Patrick, do you want to answer the question that has been seconded? Can an individual Con Ed account holder engage in community solar, or does the whole building have to?
Yes. So an individual account owner can engage in community solar without having to engage the whole building and the rest of the residents in the building. That is possible. I will say though that the only way community solar would not work for someone paying for a Con Ed bill is if it's the common area and the building already has solar on their roof. They can't get solar on their roof and then also opt into community solar under the same account. That doesn't work. But if the building's common area has solar on their roof and the residents aren't getting energy from that solar installation, they can use community solar.
So pretty much anyone can do community solar. If you're a renter, if you're in a co-op and the co-op doesn't want to go solar, if you're in a building that has already gone solar for the common area, but it's not affecting your bill, you can do community solar. So pretty much all of the Here Comes Solar staff is involved in one community solar program or other. It's a really great way to support solar in the city and offset your bill even if you don't have control of your roof.
And just to make another pitch for the ease of it, I know that someone said, oh, this seems confusing, and I know that it's sort of confusing to explain conceptually, but in terms of your actual monthly life, it's sort of just like having a Netflix bill. You get your Con Ed bill, and then you get a bill from the solar company that has sold you the solar credits, and it's auto billing if you sign up for that. And as time goes on, the utility is working harder to get it so that it's just all on one bill, all on your Con Ed bill, which is even more simple. But in the meantime, really it's just sort of like adding a subscription to your, many auto billings that you probably already have for things in your life.
Yeah, and that consolidated billing structure should be available early next year. So that's also exciting.
Great. So we're going to move on, but we see all your questions and we can talk more about them at the end. Just want to cover the other categories here.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, this last question is good. So it says, do you guys sell community solar, or can you share with us the companies that do? We don't sell community solar, but we have a place that you can sign up on our website at herecomesolar.nyc. And then we can get you set up with the two companies that we've vetted. They're called Daroga Power and Power Market, and we can talk to you about the different options there.
Great. So the next section is solar for multifamily buildings. So solar for co-ops and condos. And this is an exciting section. A lot of people think that co-ops and condos can't go solar, so we're really happy to be able to walk you through the approach. So since these buildings are often many stories and the amount of roof space per unit is much smaller, often you can't expect to offset all the electricity in your whole building, but there are a few different targets. So one approach is targeting the common area usage, so lights, laundry room, elevators. And another approach is to split the solar energy amongst the residential electricity bills. It's like community shared solar, but just within your own building, and avoiding some of those billing details we talked about. And it doesn't require every apartment to get tied in physically to solar, but it's about distributing the credits that the solar energy generates to the residential units instead of the common area. And there's a range of incentives that make this possible. These are the incentives that are typically available to multifamily buildings, but they're similar, just with some differences to the kinds of incentives that are available to all solar projects in New York City. We have the New York Sun incentive, which is offered by NYSERDA, a state agency. And that's a rebate that the installer is responsible for claiming, and 100% of the savings get passed on to the customer. So that's great. It reduces your upfront cost. And that can be 15 to 30% of the cost of the project. Then there's state tax credits and federal tax credits. These are income tax credits, which are almost always, essentially always claimed by the shareholders or the member owners and on their personal tax bills. So we'll get into how that looks a little bit. And then there's a property tax abatement, which is typically claimed by the building itself or whatever entity is paying the property taxes. And after you've sort of pulled together all the incentives, you can see that the majority of the total system cost, which is reflected in the first bar, is actually reduced by these incentives. Oh, sorry, actually, can you go back? Just want to say one more thing about the federal tax credit, which is starred, which is that we know that it's going to step down from 26% to 22% next year. And just the reason why we bring that up is that a lot of the incentives here, we encourage people to claim them when they're out there. So we're always encouraging you to move sooner with solar rather than later, because the future of the availability of the incentives is unknown. And sometimes it is known that it will decrease. So who gets the benefits in a co-op? So as I mentioned, the income tax credits, both federal and state, are for the shareholders to claim on their own tax bills as a direct proportion of their share in the co-op. So we can help you figure out how to calculate that. We have a little guide that the treasurer of the board can distribute to the shareholders to help them understand what portion of the value of the system they're able to claim on their own. But then the property tax abatement is typically applied to the property tax bill that the building pays, and the solar savings in the case of a common area offset also go to the co-op entity itself. If you do the residential, the unit scenario, then it would go to the shareholders. For a condo, it's basically the same with the exception of the property tax abatement, because in the condo, the property tax bills are paid by the member owners, not the condo at large. So the value accrues to that side of the equation. So what does this look like when we think about the lifetime of a system? The image on the left shows a cash flow for purchasing a solar system where you're able to successfully claim all the incentives that we mentioned earlier. And this is looking at the large view of all the value and the benefit that can be captured by everyone, both the co-op and the shareholders, or the co-op and the members, and then relative to the cost. So within the first 3 or 4 years here, you're able to claim all the incentives and start generating electricity, which reduces your bills immediately. And after that point, you've paid off the whole cost of the system. And for the rest of the lifetime of the system, you're generating free electricity, and the value of it is typically increasing over time along with Con Ed rates. So as Con Ed rates get more and more expensive, you're realizing more and more value by producing your own electricity. The excluding tax credit scenario shows either if you weren't able to claim all the tax credits for a range of reasons that people have on their own taxes, or if you just want to look at it like the building's view, where the building isn't going to see the income tax credits, it's only going to see a couple of the other incentives. So the payback period is longer, but still a really good investment for the building, and you still have a majority of the lifetime of the system paying, generating free electricity. So some people have already asked about financing options. We typically break it down into a direct ownership option and a third-party ownership option. So for this cash purchase scenario, the direct ownership, your building pays for it either through reserves or through a loan. There are some loans that are specific to affordable housing. There are some solar loans that are sort of designed and structured around how solar works with claiming the incentives and generating the electricity. And then also some people just, if they're already refinancing or getting a new mortgage, they'll anticipate to put the cost of the solar in that and pay whatever interest rate they're paying. There's also a third-party ownership option. This works well for some buildings. It's called a power purchase agreement, where a solar company actually installs the solar on your roof and owns it themselves, and they are responsible for maintaining it. The electricity that it generates, through a contract, you're buying that electricity from them throughout the majority of the lifetime of the system, but you're buying it at a discount. So it's a way to get solar if you have no reserves to put money down, and receive some of the benefit over the lifetime of the system, but not quite as much as if you owned it yourself. And lastly, community solar, which we just mentioned, another way that you can benefit from solar without owning the system yourself.
Just speaking on the community solar option for financing, I know there's some buildings that are interested in solar but don't have the resources to do it right now. So community solar can be a good like stopgap to do community solar for a year or two until you're ready to install solar on your building, and then you can unsubscribe and put solar on your own roof. So that can be kind of a half and half.
And also to add, like just this concept of really trying to move towards solar whenever you can, even if not always fully. Some buildings, if they offset their common area electricity through their own solar system, they still will encourage sort of like an internal building campaign to get all the shareholders to do community solar for their individual units. And then by that point, you're really offsetting, you could be offsetting a majority of the electricity of your building, which is a point of pride for a lot of buildings. So questions about solar for co-ops and condos. Just want to say there are a lot of particularities for these kinds of buildings. So we do have workshops that are specifically designed to go deeper into those, but happy to take some questions now.
Patrick, do we have any questions?
Sorry. Nothing. Something just popped up. Can you talk about solar and submetering? As a question.
Yeah. So that question is about solar with master metering. When you have a master metered building, the solar can be behind that one central account and offset that bill. And then that can be basically realized as direct savings for the building, or sort of the amount that the sub-metered accounts are charged can be the same, and the savings can just be realized to sort of the common co-op expenses. There's a few different ways to think about that, but yes, you can definitely do it for master metered buildings.
Yeah, up until last year, it was a little bit difficult to do master metering and solar at the same time, but last year the regulations changed, and so now it's actually really beneficial for larger buildings to consider solar and master metering conversion at the same time. So if you're already thinking about either one of those, we can help you figure out how to do it.
I know there was a question. Sorry, that was gonna sneeze. I know there's a question earlier about programs for moderate income homeowners to finance solar installations. And if that person, if their building was more towards like the HCFC or like affordable housing units, I definitely would encourage them to tune into the Solar for HCFC co-ops
There is,
event that we're going to talk about.
yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by homeowner. So if it's a single family home, there is a program, a loan program through NYSERDA that offers low interest loans for solar for single family homes. It's not applicable to multifamily homes or multifamily buildings yet, but for single family homes, there's a really great state program.
And Annika, there's a question about Mitchell Llamas. Where do they fit in? Do you want to talk about the project that you've done?
Yeah, so Mitchell Llamas are not HDFC co-ops, but that they still count as low to moderate income housing. So there are loan options for affordable housing that would apply to Mitchell Llamas. We have worked with a couple Mitchell Llama buildings as through the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. And solar can be a really great addition to retrofits. Yeah, generally the major difference is that they just tend to be larger than HDFC co-ops, which are often smaller scale.
So a lot of different questions.
Yeah, let's see. Can
I
we
think
find?
I'll
Yeah, go ahead, Margot.
just to sort of merge a couple of questions about typical payback periods and IRR. I will say, well, just generally, I'll say that the range of payback periods we see can be pretty large, anywhere from 3 years to 20 years if it's a really bad project for a bunch of reasons. But it is very particular to the type of building, the size of the system, and what we do actually for free is generate savings estimates. So for those who want a better sense of what it would actually be like for their building, we're happy to put together a financial analysis, and that includes payback period, includes IRR, and the lifetime net savings.
I see a question about if my co-op couldn't afford it right now and chose to fund it through community solar, is that then through lifetime of the array, or could we take it off the community market partway through? It doesn't work quite like that. So I'll answer what I hope you're trying to ask. So community solar is not installing solar on your own roof. You would be subscribing to solar somewhere else. What you could do if you can't afford to install solar on your own roof, if you can't afford to buy solar panels all outright, is the power purchase agreement. And then in that case, yes, you could enter into a power purchase agreement for no money down, pay for the electricity at a discounted rate monthly until you save enough money to buy the panels out. And then anytime after the 7th year, you can buy the system at a discounted rate. So then you could realize all of the savings. So a power purchase agreement can be a really great way to finance a system if you don't have the cash on hand. And it also gives you some flexibility to be able to buy the system later on if you then are able to.
Okay, we'll just do 1 or 2 more questions so we can get through the last section in a good amount of time. And I think one, net making money from Con Ed by consuming and providing electricity on demand. So this is a complicated question. We do have some people on our team who are doing analysis about batteries. As Annika mentioned before, it's very complicated to do them, but figuring out strategies for how batteries can save money for things like peak demand. But I will just say the concept of net money making from Con Ed, currently in New York City, if you are just sort of a typical building installing solar, there isn't a way to make any money beyond what the savings are on your bill. So if you install as much solar as possible and you basically max out your bill, you'll never get a check from Con Ed as cash beyond that. Whereas in some places around the country, there are some ways that people can do that. So it kind of it's ultimately tied to your bill. And actually that's something that we've been thinking a lot about, because we want to incentivize people putting as large a solar system on their roofs as possible, but we're not really incentivized to do that here when it's tied to directly to our consumption in our own building. So I think let's move on, and we're about to be done anyway. We have just one more small section, so we can keep answering questions at the end. Solar for 1 to 4 family buildings. Just wanted to add some special considerations for these kinds of buildings. So this is either owner occupied or a small rental. And it's the simplest form of solar because there's one owner, so they're able to claim almost all of the benefits, especially if they are, if it's an owner occupied building, they're able to claim the ones that are particular to owner occupied. And you can reduce costs for these sometimes more costly systems just because they're so small and require a certain amount of upfront work for installers. You can reduce costs with neighborhood buying groups, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And then, you know, as we mentioned before, just thinking about space constraints, sometimes there's some problem solving needed for fitting solar on the roof, and often it leads to doing canopies on these kinds of roofs. So the neighborhood buying groups, you can see we've highlighted a bunch of systems that were installed in the same time frame on brownstones. I don't know if this was the Park Slope project or the Prospect Heights one, but basically we helped organize a bunch of buildings to go solar at the same time. They selected an installer who offered a price for all of them that was sort of below typical market rate or lower than if any one of them had called the installer on their own. So it's a bulk pricing, and they were able to install solar much more affordably by doing that. And these were canopy arrays, or maybe not all of them. No,
I think
actually none of them
aren't. Yeah, I think that was a different campaign we did.
Yeah.
I wanted to add that these neighborhood buying groups are often called solarized groups. So if you Google solarize, that will tell you a lot more about how this works all across the country.
In terms of space constraints, so this FDNY requirement for a 6 foot clear path across the front of the building and then all the way to the back, this applies to all buildings that are under 100 feet in New York City. So it would apply to a lot of these larger co-ops as well. But when you have a building that's only 15 feet wide, say, it really eats up a lot of the space. I grew up in a brownstone in Park Slope, and I always joked around that we could barely fit in the hallway going up the staircase, so let alone fitting solar on the roof. And as you can see also, there's the vents. So that's why canopies end up being a really desirable option for a lot of people, and you can get up over those fire path requirements, and the firefighters just walk straight under the canopies if they need fire access. All right, questions about 1 to 4 family homes? I see, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Could these neighborhood buying groups also apply to larger buildings like co-ops? Definitely. It started out with 1 to 4 family buildings because we were seeing that as an area where there's slower adoption because of the pricing, but we're definitely happy to help coordinate buying groups for co-ops. Sometimes we've talked to people where there's a few in the same neighborhood, like in Ditmas Park, there were a bunch. And even if it's just 2 or 3 buildings, we definitely encourage bidding out together, and we can help facilitate that. So you can attract more installers because it's a larger project, and get better pricing, hopefully.
Yeah, we did a historic buying group in Harlem and up the general uptown area 2 years ago, where we focused on multifamily and affordable HDFCs and other co-ops in the uptown area. We worked with WEACT and Sustainable CUNY and UHAB to make this group together, and I think we got 11 buildings, multifamily buildings, to go solar, all in generally the same time frame. And it was the first time that a multifamily solarized campaign was successful, because as you might imagine, getting a building with many decision makers to make a decision at the same time frame as another building with many decision makers is harder. So it definitely takes a lot more concentrated effort.
There's a question about Jackson Heights. So there's a lot of folks interested in coordinating through the Queens Climate Project, or is there another coordinating body you are working with in this neighborhood? I'm not, yeah, we don't have
I can actually answer that.
Oh,
yeah, so I love you guys. The Queens Climate Project is really great, and yeah, I think we were starting to talk about a neighborhood buying group for Jackson Heights, and then the coronavirus hit, so it slowed things down, but we're definitely working on that, so stay tuned. Other than incentives for savings, how do we convince more and more Americans to transition from extractive energy systems to renewable energy systems?
That's a good one.
Getting to the macro level here. I think, I mean, this question kind of speaks to the carrot and the stick philosophy. So there's been the carrot for a while. Solar is heavily subsidized in this country, and New York City really has a lot of great incentives. But the stick is also emerging. You know, New York State passed a piece of climate legislation that had a lot of targets, and then New York City followed with the Climate Mobilization Act that is really starting to make it a requirement for certain building types, or to put a price on not doing energy efficiency measures and installing solar. So I think there's probably other kinds of approaches and maybe quasi approaches, but I think those are generally the two that we think about, both incentivizing and punishing, sort of depending on your political bent. That's how we look at least like in an industry level. Then of course there's education, which is part of what we do as an organization. Educating young people.
Yeah,
youth energy.
Youth energy is important. I think youth energy is what got us both the Climate Mobilization Act in New York City and the CLCPA, the statewide legislation. I think there's a tremendous amount of awareness about climate change now, and willingness to do something about it. I just want to add a couple details about the Climate Mobilization Act in New York City, if you don't already know. So for mid to large building, mid-sized to large buildings, there is essentially a efficiency or fossil fuel limit for each building based on their building type. And if you go above that limit, starting 5 years from now, you will be penalized. And so there's the stick that Mariko was talking about. Another aspect of it is that as of last fall, solar is required to be put on every new roof in New York City, small or large, with the exception of affordable housing, which has its own requirements. So that the fact that it's now mandated in any place where it's reasonable, where it will actually fit, is one way to make people move to renewable energy systems rather than extractive energy.
Loving all these responses in the chat here.
Yeah.
Okay. Just so you all know, we are at the end of our presentation, so it's great that folks are opening up general questions of all kinds.
So yeah, we'll stay on here and answer questions. I know we have a lot of questions backed up, so we'll keep answering questions. But just to let you know, if anyone has to jump off, the rest of our workshops you can find at herecomesolar.nyc/free online workshops. If you want to know more for yourself or for your building, you can either email Patrick or fill out the form at herecomesolar.nyc. And we can contact you with more information about whatever type of solar you're interested in. We're a nonprofit, so we do everything for either free or very low pricing, and the initial estimate, viability check, and savings estimate for whatever type of system you're considering is always free for anyone we work with.
I see a question about rooftop audits and assessments these days, which is great. I wanted to actually kind of close out with that, which some folks might have questions about going solar during these times when there's been a pause on non-essential construction. There are efforts, or not efforts, but I mean, there are signs of New York State and New York City sort of changing what is considered, whether solar is considered essential or not, and opening up construction for solar. But in the meantime, there is a lot to be done to develop your solar project. Construction wouldn't actually happen for a few months out anyway if you decided to go solar now. So now is a good time for doing preliminary assessments. We typically do on-site assessments after we've done kind of a preliminary remote analysis where we would come to your building, check out the roof, check out the electrical. And right now we've developed a way to do that remotely where we engage your building staff or someone on your building who's qualified to go into the electrical room and go on the roof to take a series of photographs that we would need to be able to put together a site report. So not to fear, we can actually advance to that level, and then we can help folks put out an RFP, a request for proposals, to bid out their projects, which is another part of our service. And now is a really great time to get to ask installers to put forth proposals because they have capacity and they're trying to get projects done, and we anticipate we'd get a lot of really good proposals during this time from a lot of companies.
Kind of a silver lining. Lorraine asks, so all new development in New York City is required to install solar panels? Yes, all new, not affordable development is required to install solar panels if you can. You know, if you're building a new Empire State Building and there's no room on the roof, then you don't have to. But if you have the space for it, you have to include solar or a green roof. When going solar, what are the precursor actions like redoing roofs that can be lumped in as prerequisites for the solar install and then therefore get the federal and state tax benefits applied to those actions? It's a good question. Some solar installers will redo a roof so you can get as part of the same project as the solar installation. So then you could get the federal tax credit on both the roof and the solar installation. Unless the solar installer is also a roofing contractor and they invoice it as all one invoice, we're not sure that that is kosher from the IRS. No one has ever actually litigated it yet, and it's kind of unclear in the ruling. So many solar installers do it, and it may or may not be okay. But usually it's just the roof. It could be batteries, as batteries are. You can definitely lump batteries in with solar for the tax credits. But for roofs and other types of building improvements, it's yeah. For roofs and other types of building improvements, it's a little bit gray. So I would ask an accountant, not us. Patrick, what questions did we have saved from earlier?
Okay, questions from earlier. There are a lot of little ones that we didn't touch on. One of them from the beginning is, with chimneys, would a canopy array be best? That's a simple one. You don't have to do a canopy array because you have chimneys on it. It depends on how the chimneys shade out the roof. If the chimneys are placed in positions where ballasted wouldn't be able to produce enough energy due to the shade, and if they're widespread enough that a planer could do the job as well, then we tap into a canopy installation. But just because a chimney shades your roof isn't a means to immediately jump onto canopies. Since they're the most expensive one, we try to use them in the way that makes the most sense for your building and your desire for solar. And there's another one, canopy arrays, wind load. Will canopy work on parking lot rather than the roofs? There are carports that get installed like throughout the country where cars like can park there and charge their electric vehicles with them, and those are like in a sense grounded canopy installations. So they can work on the roofs and also on the ground as well. As Annika mentioned earlier, the canopies have to withstand 110-mile-per-hour sustained winds. So in either situation, the canopy can work.
And I want to add, there's a really exciting project at JFK Airport. They are in the process of installing a series of canopy arrays on their parking lots. It's going to be, as far as I know, the largest solar installation in the city. It's probably a couple years out because it's a really big project, but keep an eye out for that in the future.
There's another question about the rule of thumb for amount of shading. Interesting enough, shading is it's more about the density of the shade than about like shade itself. Because we've seen projects where tall buildings were to the south, and they did cast shade on the building, but because of the space between the building itself, the tall building, and the building that it was shading, we did a deeper analysis into its actual ability to have solar on it, and we saw that the shade density wasn't as bad as it would initially appear. So we were able to go through with prospectus for solar for that building. So the rule of thumb for shading, it's a little tricky in case by case, but if you have a tall building directly south of your building, then it's a good way to assume that solar might not work for either a portion or a majority of your roof, depending on how tall the building is south to you. And if there's equipment on the roof that does shading as well, you can still put solar if there's room on other parts of the roof.
I see a great and complex question from Eric out in Buffalo, which I appreciate this question. And I just want to say that I'm very inspired by the environmental justice work that's happening in Buffalo. I've been out a few times and met some of the groups, and it's pretty amazing. There's a question about, have any inequalities within New York City's electrical system been discovered that affect specific communities over others when there are power outages or any kind of, any kind of disasters related to electricity? A lot of our mission is about environmental justice and about making sure the energy burden doesn't fall disproportionately in terms of cost on lower income New Yorkers. But your question about whether there's really been any specific instances, I think, is a lot of what our resilient solar program, which is not specifically being represented on this workshop, but is part of the Here Comes Solar team. The resilient solar is trying to address what happens when there are power outages and how to have community centers continue to generate power with battery backup. And part of that is about thinking about particular communities on the front line. So in New York City, the communities that are often most affected by outages during a storm are those that have above ground power lines. And that's a lot of the neighborhoods that are closer to the coast, like farther out in Brooklyn and in Queens. And sometimes those communities are lower income, and it really affects them the most when power goes down, and sort of the last to have the power get fixed. So having these community centers where people can go and charge their phones during an emergency, or community volunteer ambulance services that are able to still be running because they have electricity, is really important. There's obviously so much more to be done with that. There isn't solar on every one of those homes, but it is a step that we're taking, and it's funded by the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery. So anyway, that's just one example that we see.
Yeah, I think probably the major thing, I mean, there's so many environmental justice issues in New York City, but the one that is most closely linked to electricity and solar is that everyone pays into the energy efficiency and solar incentive fund through our electricity bills. But the vast majority of the incentives are currently being taken by single family homeowners who are able to go solar in non-urban areas, and renters so far aren't really able to take advantage of that. And so that's one of the reasons why we're excited about, you know, community solar and solar for co-ops and multifamily buildings, is to be able to address that disparity.
Annika, can you also share about the concept of peakers and sort of the most dirty power plants, which are also often cited? Because just to say, solar in a neighborhood that experiences a lot of pollution, either from cars or from power plants, just having solar on the roofs there doesn't actually make the air cleaner necessarily directly, right? And so Annika, I think, can explain a little bit about how overall it can actually help.
Yeah, I think, so one of the things about the way that electricity works in New York City is usually the most energy that we use in the course of the year is some very hot early afternoons in the summer when everyone's running their air conditioning. And so at those times, we have a series of what are called peaker plants, which are very small power plants that are run on the dirtiest type of oil. And they're on roofs of buildings in New York City, primarily in lower income neighborhoods. And they turn on just for those highest demand times. And so if we're able to install solar, which will, you know, produce energy on those especially hot days, and we're able to install it in the parts of the grid, the city where it's needed most, which is happening, then we can make sure that those peaker plants don't need to turn on, and the pollution that is generated from them doesn't happen as much. That's a large part of the energy generation pollution that we have in the city, and solar can directly affect that. There was a question. Okay.
Yeah,
There's a question about
okay.
improvements in solar panel efficiency and reduction in size. Solar panels, unfortunately, have not improved very quickly. So it's not in the scale of 2 years. There's been some improvement, but it's been very incremental. I read somewhere that solar panels now are somewhere around 20% more efficient than they were in the 70s. So it's not a huge increase in production efficiency. The biggest difference in the past 10 to 15 years has been in the price of the panels, and that has really bottomed out, which is great, and has made solar much more effective and viable for everyone around the world. So it's unfortunate that, you know, the technology isn't exploding, but the benefit of that is it means that you won't have to upgrade your solar panels in, you know, 5 years when there's like a new model, because if the solar panels are working now, they'll continue working for 25 years and you won't have to replace them.
I remember there's another question about facades that I wanted to answer real quick. It is possible to install solar on the facade of a building, but the most efficient solar panels will always be like, or at least for the time being on the roofs. If you install it on the facade, its capability for energy generation diminishes greatly. It won't produce as much power, and it's not as efficient because it's on the sides. So the energy that it's getting in, and also the optimal operating temperature, it's not going to be as great as if it were just on the roof.
Yeah, so if you think about it, the sun is usually above us. So if a solar panel is, even if it's flat on the roof, it's best if it's tilted, but if it's flat on the roof, it'll still get the sun when it's above it. If you have a solar panel that's vertical, it'll only get the sun when it's like right at the horizon in the morning and in the evening, and it won't produce very much power.
I saw a question about demand for community solar in New York City. and whether the demand outweighs the supply? That's a great question. Community solar is increasing in popularity, and it does take time for the solar projects to get developed, finding appropriate roof space, the company leasing the roof, installing the system, et cetera. So sometimes when you sign up, there could be a few months delay before you actually start getting credits as they're putting on new projects. Something that's really exciting is that in our program, we actually have helped develop a sort of small community solar project just by way of supporting an owner who has a rental property who has a very large roof, and they were able to advance a project where it serves about 15 subscribers, and I actually subscribed to that project. So I'm waiting a couple months for it to come online, but so more and more is happening all the time. So we encourage folks to sign up, and it pushes forth, you know, that market signal for there to be more to happen. So we're going to close out in just a few more minutes. So any final questions? And as you can see, the contact information is still up on the screen, so feel free to email us afterwards.
I remember earlier there were two questions. One is that the 10%, if it was the standard, or if it could go higher, and what determines that amount, and also
For community solar?
yeah, for community solar. And also when it comes to community solar outside of New York City, is the solar credits / adjustment system the same? So for the 10% or greater, well, the simplest way to say is that it depends on the market and what the solar management company can offer reasonably in order to keep themselves afloat and running as a business. I'm sure, I shouldn't say I'm sure, it is possible in the future for that 10% savings to be increased, but that it depends on the market and like the competition within the city. It's not something as clear to say. And for the solar credits and adjustment system, it depends on this one I might have to ask Annika for, but I feel like it depends on where you are and how they structure their whole system around community solar. It's really like region specific.
There was a question a little while ago about whether homes should be weatherized before you install a solar system. In general, you should always do efficiency work on your home. It's often the cheapest and most cost-effective thing that you can do to save energy. Weatherization is often for heating, and so then, you know, heating around here is usually gas or occasionally oil. So solar wouldn't really interact with that, but you should definitely do it. If it's something like changing out light bulbs that would reduce your electricity load, then yeah, we would definitely recommend doing that earlier, because you don't want to install a system that is larger than you need. You could get a smaller system if you end up using less electricity. There are a couple of good programs for light bulb replacement through Edison. So I would recommend looking into that. They have, I think, at least for affordable housing. I'm not sure if it's for all multifamily buildings, but they have a great light bulb switch out program that they can do often for free. Okay.
To have the majority of the questions in the backlog.
Great.
Yeah.
Well,
Amazing.
oh,
well, I guess, okay. Marigo, did you answer Eric's question about New Yorkers and frontline communities?
I did. I answered in the chat.
Great.
But yeah, the short answer is yes. And we have a green workforce program that actually helps those folks get access to solar training, or provides the training. Thank you all so much. We're going to close out. We will. Oh,
sorry. One last quick thing. Can customers sub-metered accounts do community solar? Yes. It won't be like yeah. Well, sub-metering in the sense that
If you're in
Okay.
a sub-metered account, which means that you're in a master metered building, then only the master meter can switch to solar. You can't do it yourself, unfortunately, as a sub-metered account.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. We're going to follow up with an email to everybody who is here today with the slides, contact information, a link to sign up for more information about community solar. It's not an automatic sign up, but it'll be the entry point for us to connect you with one of the programs. And yeah, really great to see you all. Thanks for all your questions.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.